Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Wednesday, September 8th, 2021. For those of you that might be new to tonight's format, this is where we take any questions or comments, any topics from the live audience and respond to those. So if you have one of those, submit them at any time. Malia, who's moderating for me this evening, will then pass those on when there's time in the webinar for those. I'll tell you one thing. We have two questions that are pre-submitted, so I'll start with the pre-submitted questions, but you can always submit questions or topics, suggestions to webinar@evoketherapy.com in between sessions, in between broadcasts. So feel free to enter those at any time. And let me get with the questions that are left over from last time. Somebody writes, with trauma upon trauma, including the sibling not in treatment, I feel caught by relentless fight, flight, dread, and flooding. I do feel loved and in a community, which typically is my medicine. This distress sits on top of a profound childhood trauma. How do we regain safety inside when the nonstop challenge has hijacked my nervous system and it's hard to receive support and connection? One of the things I talk about all the time is it sounds like you already have community, you already have a self-care practice. And so I'm not starting from that point with you. But for the rest of you listening or watching, what I would say is when a child is struggling or when you're going through something difficult, you can talk about how I didn't need this before, I was fine before. It might not even be your problem as you see it, like the child themselves or the spouse or the other person is struggling. But the situation asks of you, it kind of requires of you that you find other sources of support. So not only do I honor your question, but I respect the wisdom of it. For me, being in therapy on a regular basis, even when I'm not in crisis, like a lot of healthcare practices, if we wait just until there are signs or symptoms, oftentimes it's more difficult to treat. In fact, it might be, when we're talking about our physical health, it might be too far along to even repair. But with psychology, with our emotional well-being, I think it's really important to establish a practice in therapy that you have a relationship, you have a place to go, you have a regular schedule, so that when that comes up for you, when something comes up, when a stressor comes up for you, add it on top of whatever else you've been carrying in your life, you have somebody that you trust, you have a working relationship. Like I've talked about, going to finding support groups. I kind of read in between the lines, and I'm not sure if I'm reading it correctly, but when you talk about your community is your medicine, you might need more communities or different communities. Having a 12-step group, a home group is what they call the one that you identify as kind of your base home group. Having a home group can be a fantastic place to find your tribe, to find your people. Finding a sponsor that you can call. I talk to this with my clients that I have, that the difference between a sponsor is you can call them or text them anytime, and they volunteered, right? They've signed up for the act of service, the act of being there when they can, in a moment's notice, or late on a weekend, or in the middle of the night, or in the morning. And so you have that other person that you can reach out to and get help. But I think we've got to surround ourselves. Thinking about all these various communities that I'm mentioning, we've got to surround ourselves with somebody or some people that can be our people in this. And you might have a church community, you might have a local community where in normal circumstances it fits your emotional needs, your social needs. But these kinds of situations that we're talking about at Evoke, where you have a struggling child or a struggling loved one, it asks of you to reach deeper, to find other sources of support, to find people that aren't just in your community and maybe share a belief system with you, but that are willing and able to talk about and to listen to the kind of trauma that you're describing here. Reading books, listening to podcasts, showing up to these broadcasts, those can add a little bit to it, because even though you and I don't have a talking relationship back and forth, you can get fed, right? You can You can feel seen, you can feel understood, at least by somebody during a live broadcast like this, or even listening to a podcast. So my thought is, it sounds like under normal circumstances that the community that you have is enough, and now you need to find more people. It's part of why we have the parent support groups once a week online. It's part of why we have the alumni support groups for people that are farther along in the path, because you can connect to those people, maybe relate to those people if your child was in therapy a year, 5 or 7 years ago. Also, the intensives support group can be a great connection for you if you've been through the intensive. Coming to an intensive, it's never too early in the broadcast for me to mention that service. Coming to an intensive can be a place. There are people watching right now, more than one on the list. I can see all of your names. I can see at least three, maybe four if I spend a little bit more time looking. People who have found each other in the intensive program, who remain in contact, who find that those people are sources of support for them. So going to places where people that are experiencing the same kind of trauma, or maybe even vicarious trauma that you're experiencing, going to find places where people show up to talk about that, to tell their story, is really, really, really important. And again, I want to welcome you and say how glad I am that you showed up, that you asked the question to this or to these broadcasts, because while it might not be the same connection as sitting across from somebody and having coffee, or sitting in a circle in the basement of a church, it's really important that you be seen, that you get heard, that you be able to tell your story to somebody who has the ears to be able to hear it, to somebody that's not going to give you trite answers or advice, or assume that there's a simple or a quick fix to what in many cases can be an unsolvable problem, at least from your perspective. So thank you for asking it, and those are kind of my thoughts about it. Somebody writes, Dr. Reedy, can you please expand on what you mean by, quote, don't undress your children, unquote, and, quote, don't tear the defense away, unquote. My 13-year-old daughter has finished Wilderness and is at a residential boarding school. I'm having a difficult time sharing with others where my daughter is and a little bit about why she is what she is going through, as a way to be authentic and real while keeping our business our business. There's really two issues here, because when I talk about not undressing your children or not tearing away the defense, I'm mostly talking about in your interactions with them. And to undress the child, or to humiliate the child, is to not account for, I have several points, to not account for the power differential. Not only do you have authority over your children when they're adolescents and pre-adults, but even after that, you have financial authority in many cases, right? You're supporting them. But maybe most important or most tender, you have a kind of authority in your role that you'll never not be in, which is you're the parent. You know this because you're a child of a parent also, that parents can and do in most cases occupy an entirely different part of our psyche, part of our mental construct. They occupy a very different position than our children, or than that others do in most cases. So your reactions, your feelings, your expressions, they land differently with your children than they do with a peer, with a spouse, than they do ideally with you when your child does the same kind of thing to you. So when I'm talking about not undressing your children, it comes from a statement that my therapist taught me many years ago, which is we have to give children their dignity. So what that means is, you might see a behavior and you might even have a really educated guess at what's underneath it. But the advice is to be careful. Just because you've developed what I call X-ray vision, psychologically speaking, doesn't mean you should use it. As a therapist, I think I've been more guilty of this idea than most people, especially when I and they were younger, my children were younger, because I would take my knowledge about human psychology and I would just impose it on the child. I would blurt it out. I would metaphorically undress them. I would go right. It's kind of like the idea of outing somebody. That's probably a great analogy to illustrate another way that you could undress or humiliate somebody or remove the dignity from somebody. It's not your job to out somebody when we're talking about LGBTQ issues. And so similarly, outing somebody psychologically is the same kind of wound, the same kind of problem. Remember, when somebody has experienced trauma, and everybody has experienced some trauma, big or little, when somebody experiences trauma, one of the key features of trauma is the loss of control. That in most cases it's happening to you. So when we exercise our power and control over somebody, when we expose somebody, when we out somebody, when we use our x-ray vision to see past the defense, we're taking away their control. In essence, in a kind of a sort of way, we are re-traumatizing them. So your x-ray vision is to inform you. Your awareness about your child's issues is to inform you. When I talk about uh, generically or generally about children and their issues, self-sabotage was the last broadcast, and I give you an idea about the reasons why someone might be doing it, it's not meant for you to go and say that to them or to confront it. You want to do as little of that as you absolutely have to. You can make decisions based on that, right? You can have boundaries about limits and consequences and your own intervention. But to vocalize it is to expose them, is to out them. When it comes to telling your story, because that's kind of the other, you kind of talked about my ideas in the context of the fact that it's difficult for you to talk about this with your other children. First and foremost, I would say, can you find confidential spaces like therapy or 12-step support groups or other support groups to share that? So you're not violating your child's story by getting it out into the world with people that aren't safe. It's unreasonable, I think unhealthy for people in our lives that if we do something or if we're struggling, to expect the people in our lives not to talk about it with anybody. I've learned as a husband and a father, one of the things I've I know this is kind of an old joke, but the excitement I have about paying for my children to go to their intensives, my older children, or paying for my children to go to therapy, is I know that's a place where they're going to talk about me, and that's exactly the right place to talk about their father or their mother or their childhood. And even with my wife, I want her to have friends to be able to vent about me. And in the past, when she has been a regular participant in support groups, I want her to have a sponsor. I want her to be able to go and talk about how hard it is to be my spouse and vice versa. I need places to share that and to talk about that. So you can talk to your child about what's fair. You can talk to your child about what they're okay with or not okay with. But from me to you, it's unreasonable to require you to have no outlet. So finding confidential spaces, definitely spaces where the child doesn't know the person that you're venting to, in some cases, is ideal, where they're not operating or living in the same circles, socially speaking. So talking to your child's best friend's parent or an aunt or an uncle, your brother or sister, that they then have to interact with can create an extreme kind of vulnerability for them. And I know you might want to talk about anybody. You might want to be able to talk to anybody, but those are the kind of considerations that you can take. But your child might say, if you talk to them, I'm okay with that also. But you need to set some kind of boundary that you can't talk to anybody. I just wouldn't support that. To think about them and to think through them in some of the ways that I'm describing this evening, I'm supportive of that. I think that's I just think it's I think it's crazy to constrict somebody to the point that they're not allowed to talk to anybody. So finding confidential spaces. To the people that are close to you, I get really kind of passionate about this next idea. To the people that are close to you, family and close friends, it's important that you and I are able to say to the people that are close to us, excuse me, excuse me, Malia, if you can mark that down so I can delete that from the podcast. To have people in your circle, your close circle, where you don't want to tell them everything is really important also. One of the ways of love and friendship, one of the ways to demonstrate love and friendship is to be able to say to somebody, it's okay if you can't talk to me about it. I think one of the most common mistakes I hear in therapy when people are talking about relationships is they think that people are obligated to share when they're struggling some kind of the details. So what I would say is, if you set a boundary with somebody, or you keep it vague, or you say I'm struggling but I can't, or I don't want to talk about it because some of it's not my story to tell, but I have a therapist, or I have some people that I can talk to that aren't in the family or close to it. If the person can't tolerate that and hold you and meet you where you're at with that, in essence, they're not your people either. I mean, they might be your people in some situations and circumstances. They might provide you support and connection in other ways. But in this topic, in this way, with what you're struggling with, they're not capable of responding. A healthy friend, a healthy family member won't demand you because of their need. They won't demand that you come and talk to them about what you're struggling with. They'll support, they'll honor, they'll be patient, they'll even understand that it might not be something you can talk to them about. And by the way, one of the things you learn with people is when they respect your boundaries like that, you're more likely to come to them because they're safe, because they're not coming to your crisis with their baggage, with their issues. So thanks for the question. Somebody writes, I've been going to a 12-step group and they talk so much about relationship with a higher power. What methods do you use to create a personal relationship with a higher power? It's been a challenge for me over the years. It's so hard for me to talk about personally. The question is, what have I done? It's so hard for me to talk about my relationship with a higher power in a way that I think makes sense. You asked how I do it, so I'll just answer it as you asked it. I started off with for me realizing that maybe more of what Buddhists talk about when they talk about radical acceptance instead of faith. I don't necessarily have faith in something or someone or some being who's watching out and controlling things and making sure that I'm okay. That's not how I see it. Mine comes from more the Buddhist thinking where what is okay. I'll use death for an example. A lot of people, it's very important to them to have a higher power and an idea of an afterlife. And I support my clients and my friends and family with that idea 1000%. But for me, if you struggle with a higher power, kind of in the traditional sense, as I did, my take home is I trust the universe. I trust life. I trust that I'll be okay because the universe and life has been operating this way for eons, and everybody so far has made it. One client shared with me some time ago, after a profound loss in their lives, they shared with me this quote that they found in a grief book, the opening line in a grief book. I'm sure if you Googled it, you could find it, but the opening line in the grief book that she was reading said, all of us come from a long line of dead people. I imagine it was a clever and kind of humorous way to break the ice and to start to talk about death, but that's kind of the way that I think about it. So first it was very vague and nebulous. It's become I think about the universe or the way a little bit more concretely now than I did when I was younger, when I first started in this process. Like again, it first just started with a kind of a humility that I don't always know what's right. I don't always have the answer, to a radical acceptance of this is the way that it is. The circumstances are the way that they are. And if I can lean into them, it's kind of like a Taoist idea too. The Tao means the way, literally. This is the way the universe operates. This is the way that life is. So maybe refuge recovery. And I know there's an offshoot of refuge recovery, which I'm not sure the name of right now, but refuge recovery is a nice place to go to if the higher power thing is a sticking point for you. I know people will say like a doorknob or a tree or the sun can be your higher power. But I think what people are really saying is that idea that I was talking about, that I don't know and I don't have all the answers and I can't control it. So uh, I'm going to call it a doorknob because it's just not me. Some people think of the support group itself, the institution of 12 steps, as being their higher power. I've heard people in 12-step circles talk about the word God for them is the acronym for a group of drunks, right? And when I go to that room and I practice my recovery in that room, I'm surrendering and trusting a higher power, an idea or set of ideas to kind of guide me, to comfort me, to give me a safe place. So those are some of my ideas. It's been by far one of the most difficult things for me to be able to understand from other people. I've asked the question you asked me many, many times. I've been asked the question many, many times, and what I shared with you this evening are my answers, but it's very, very nuanced and very personal and very individual. I hope it helps, even if my answer isn't your answer. I hope some of it gives you sparks something for you. Somebody writes, can Evoke do anything to help parents with next step? My 17 and a half-year-old son is at Cascades willingly. In fact, you met him in the field a few weeks ago or so. I think he went so he could find me a net to himself. That's probably a typo. And to me, how much he says that he wants to start so he can make changes in his life. I think he's naive about what's out there. He even thinks maybe a therapeutic boarding school. I'm pretty sure that a short-term residential rehab therapy program like Ascend or Family First could expose him to the whole new world of connection and give him time out of Evoke to think more long-term. I've never had an educational consultant and don't want one now if I can avoid it. But I don't feel like the program, the therapists, but I can't avoid it. And I don't know the programs and the therapists. I feel like there should be a role for Evoke here. Thanks. First of all, absolutely. Yes. You can ask Jamie for guidance, and she can consult with me and her team and others that have worked with young adults and definitely provide you some options. If you don't have a consultant and you don't want to hire one, then we can and do provide that. So I'll send a little email to Jamie and remind her of that. But just to make sure that we can provide you with that support. Every therapist in every capacity is obligated to provide recommendations to clients when they can. So we can do that for you, for sure. All right, I'm waiting. Well, there's one. Do you recommend discussing with a teen about struggles such as ADD, impulsivity, attachment issues? And if yes, what does it look like? My concern is I don't want our son to feel shamed or that he is not okay. It doesn't help that a lot of our diagnoses have the word disorder at the end, right? I agree with everything you share, but outside of Vogue, it is not easy to find other therapists who practice your sound teachings. It's frustrating that good mental health help is still hard to find. Schools are certainly not helping kids with learning differences. It's a great question. I mean, The simple answer is yes. I mean, I think you can talk to your child. I think you can ask questions. I've told this story before about my mother-in-law, who was a teacher for her career. She's retired now. And after reading my first book, right when it came out, she said, I think you should go talk to teachers and teach them how to deal with children today and the challenges children have. And I said, I could do that. And since then, I have talked to a lot of school organizations and teachers. In fact, I have another one coming up here this fall where I'm speaking to a school, but to the leadership at a school. But ultimately, what I said to her that day, that moment was, I really wouldn't teach teachers how to understand children. I'd teach them how to listen. And then the children would tell them all that they need to know. And so for you, ask questions. I brought up a mental health topic with my daughter just the other day that I thought was, from my perspective, was harmless and non-invasive. I didn't have a lot of energy and anxiety about it, and I just brought it up kind of matter of fact. And she told me how hard it was that I brought it up and that I needed to be careful with her and ask her a certain way, which I said, okay. There was no shame in it. She definitely told me that the way I brought it up and the timing of my bringing it up for her didn't work, which makes sense. I told her, if any issue becomes severe enough, I'm not going to ask for permission, right? It's my younger one, still an adolescent. And I said to her, if things become risky or dangerous or unstable, it doesn't matter. The small brushstrokes aren't going to matter. So I'm just going to make my decisions and talk about it the ways that I need to make myself feel safe and okay as a father in my role. So I would essentially ask that question that you wrote. I would essentially ask the people around you the same thing. Now, if your child says, no, I don't want to talk about anything, again, if you can respect that boundary, great. If you feel compelled, do it. Talking to your own therapist and understanding, is this my unchecked anxiety? Is it really me taking from the child and trying to be reassured by the child? Am I taking away their dignity, like I talked about in the first question of the evening? Or is this just sound thinking? With regard with regard to finding therapists who do what I talk about, who teach what I talk about, and have the sound reasoning, the fact of the matter is, I haven't found very many either. I've found one, my therapist. And now I'm trying to teach it to all the therapists that I supervise, all the therapists that work at all of our Evoke programs as often as possible. It's hard to learn this stuff. It's hard to learn attachment-based therapy. It's hard to understand that what our issues are and how they come into play as parents, spouses, as therapists. The books, the article that I wrote, Malia, could you Google Brad Reedy and psychology versus therapy and then share the link for the article that I wrote for the NatSap Journal? Brad Reedy and psychology versus therapy. I wrote an article about this. I've written blogs about it. Obviously it's a chapter in my new book. In fact, I'm writing another book right now with a couple of different men about an issue that's really relevant and locally focused, but really I think is across the spectrum, about a conservative Mormon father and his son who came out 15 years ago. The son is now 40. And this conservative Mormon father, or historically he's been conservative, this Mormon father who's kind of an icon in the Mormon church because he's a songwriter and he's done the commercials and done some movies for the church. I'm talking about their journey of reconciliation and their journey together, and how it's not just good enough and kind of tolerable, but it's actually become this wonderful spiritual love-filled journey for the both of them, and reconnecting and looking at their own issues. And I'm providing kind of commentary on their journey as they write their story. And in the conclusion, the younger guy, the one his name is Jeff McClain. He's the one that's the primary author because it's his story of growing up gay in Mormon Utah. He talked about my conclusion that I wrote to the book and saying, I'm so glad that you talked in the conclusion about what to look for in the therapy and what therapy can do for you in this process. So I guess I'm just telling you I have the same experience. And that's why we have to be educated consumers with therapy. I've been thinking the past few years, how much I encourage people to go to therapy, but I have to learn to say, go to good therapy. I mean, it's, in essence, the blogs that I've written and the chapter that I wrote and this conclusion that Jeff is referring to, these chapters are saying this is what to look for in a therapist. This research article, and for those of you that are listening, not watching, just Google my name, Brad Reedy, and then therapy, or excuse me, psychology versus therapy, and it'll come up. I wrote it for the NatSap Journal along with my wife. It is what I have learned that I didn't know as a young therapist, but I learned because sitting on the couch, the other couch, the client couch, I learned what I needed. And when I went through, well, not just one, but when I went through my deepest crises in my life, and my therapist, who's amazing, was able to sit with me and to listen and to contain, that's the clinical word, the technical word, basically hold space in a non-judgmental, curious way, really, really demonstrating love, what I think is love. Then I realized, oh, I now understand what heals people. It's not your techniques, not you're offering them your conceptualization. It's not even the skills or the tools. All of those can augment the work, but the fundamental healing power is the empathic capability of the therapist. Sitting across, Jamie Gill says, my therapist says, sitting across from an empathic other, a capable and empathic other, changes us. I was sharing it with the group yesterday that I was visiting. What was once bad or unacceptable now just becomes what it is. Becomes nothing, she says. And so in the context where you're not feeling judged, or like you have to take care of somebody or manage somebody's anxiety or get better so the therapist feels better about themselves, all of those things, and you just get to be. I was teaching the therapist this yesterday and in service. I said, be careful of theories that seem to spend so much energy trying to fix clients, and really spend your time and energy as a therapist trying to understand the client, and they will fix themselves. That's what Carl Rogers did do that, the master therapist, but I was going to refer to Fred Rogers. That's what he did. He kind of showed us the way. The best on-screen therapist I've ever seen in my life. The best on-screen therapy I've ever seen in my life. Thank you. Somebody says, what guidance do you have for families where one parent has been doing the work and is ready for the kid to come home, and the other parent hasn't been doing the work and is not so confident? Oh, I hate questions about co-parenting. It's kind of the way I feel about, I hate them because they're hard to answer. Glad you asked it, actually. But I hate having the answer because it's like I always say, no matter what I say, if you are unequally yoked, if you're not on the same page, you're fighting a battle with one hand tied behind your back. I don't know how to negotiate that. I was just thinking, it just came to my mind while I was answering. When we do couples intensives, we do individual couple intensives. When we do those, typically it's one partner, usually the wife, although we do same-sex couples and we do couples where the roles are reversed. But it's not uncommon that the wife comes in and says, I want more emotional connection from my husband. And the husband comes in saying, it's not my style, or I feel criticized, right? That's kind of the, forgive the stereotype, but that's kind of a presentation that is pretty common. But what we get to eventually is, in this example, using the genders that I've outlined as this stereotype, the wife learns that she's been doing things with the husband that make him not feel safe. And the husband learns that in his entire life, he's learned not to tell the truth or not to talk because he doesn't feel safe, first in his family of origin, and then in his marriage or his partnership. And so she realizes that her job is to be a safe container, and he realizes that his job is to tell the truth regardless of the reaction, to kind of be willing to fight, if you will, to be willing to stand up. He also needs to be empowered to know that it's not wrong to not trust the process. That's really important. One of my biggest pet peeves in soapboxes is that in self-help literature that there is shame associated with mental health, even in our most famous self-help writers and authors, that they talk about things like vulnerability as a virtue. Vulnerability is not a virtue. Vulnerability is just something that you can do when you feel safe or you have enough courage to do it. And a lack of vulnerability means that you don't feel safe. In fact, you would be unwise to be vulnerable in lots of relationships and lots of circumstances with lots of your histories. So going back to the question, do your work, find your support, and ask yourself, is there something in this process that feels unsafe for my spouse? Am I contributing to that lack of safety? Is my impatience or anxiety or critique or inability to contain him or her, am I contributing to the very problem that I'm complaining about? And make that your project. Can you have a dialogue around that? Finding a good couples therapist who can help you both work through your projects and how your projects intersect. I know it's selling my book, and I think I make $4 off of everyone that gets sold. But in the book, The Audacity to Be You, I talk about this project with partners, and in the chapters on marriage and the chapters on love. So that's another place to go to understand how you might be, to borrow the phrase from our last broadcast, self-sabotage. You might be, Jamie always says to me, it's important that family members with an identified patient have the courage to be able to say, I'm part of this dynamic too. And I want to understand why. I've had this fantasy of writing one of these famous self-help authors who talks so much about vulnerability. And I don't need to say her name because you all know who I'm talking about, or you don't, and that's okay too. And I want to write this really compassionate, gentle, loving, inviting kind of email to her. I was fantasizing about this today and say, be careful, because you're empowering people to state their truth, and that's wonderful. But you're not talking about when not to do it. You're not talking about how a lot of them have good reasons to have walls up. And you're not talking about how difficult it is for those people sometimes to hold space for other people. In my perspective, ideally, psychology and therapy, both, kind of set a different frame, a different context. They're a different conceptualization. They are, it's like Rumi said in his famous poem that gets quoted all the time when he says, there is a field out beyond right doing and wrong doing, and I will meet you there. It's what Khalil Gibran says in his poem on good and evil out of the book The Prophet. It's psychology. What I love about psychology and therapy is it changes the context from right and wrong, good and bad, to can and can't, able and not able, wounded and healed, broken and integrated, right? Like those they have so much less stigma associated with them. Where that's why one of our 8 tools is to avoid imperatives: good, bad, right, wrong, have to, should, need to, ought to. And I think there's a lot of shoulding, even in some of the most popular therapy and self-help writing. Thank you. Somebody writes, my son had a great deal of trauma in his first 6 months of life. He doesn't remember it, of course, and is adamant it had no effect on him, and he does not want to look at it or its effect on his life. He is anti-therapy in general at this point. I'm afraid he can't move forward without looking and is very stuck. What's the best way to approach this? I, a lot of these questions would be best answered in a dialogue, but I can't talk to all of you every day when you have these questions. So I'll answer it not in a dialogue, and I would say back off, because the first, like, forcing therapy on somebody, even if you're right. And by the way, as I said earlier, I'm a huge fan of therapy. The biggest fan of therapy is still imposing your idea on them. It's still taking away their power. One of the quotes that I often reference from Dr. Jamie Gill is where she says, unkind people and inadequate therapists are famous for taking away the defense before considering the cost. Jamie, when she was in graduate school, said one of her professors said to all the students, you are all crutch stealers. And you have these closets full of crutches that you've collected from your clients, that you've stolen from them. And you're proud of yourselves for stealing away these crutches. And then the professor pointed out, people need these crutches. These crutches have saved them. They've been their lifeline. Yes, they may be wearing themselves out, but to snatch it away is, in a sense, to abuse somebody in a different way. It's fundamentally the same. So back off. Like a lot of things, get curious about why he doesn't trust therapy. Like I said earlier, with these examples where, again, referring to the stereotype of the woman and the man, could be same sex, could both be men, or it could be flipped, but where the woman wants the husband to talk more and the husband feels criticized and not safe. What the husband or the male partner or the one in this role will often say to me, if I knew that therapy was going to feel like this, I would have come years ago. I think that's true of most people. But because most therapy isn't like this, and most people don't understand what therapy is or what it looks like, I think people are wise to distrust it. Why sit in front of a therapist who knows what you should do and shouldn't do, who has all the answers? What I jokingly say to people is, they already have a parent. They don't need another one. You need something different. I teach this to our therapists. You don't need to be a parent who knows what's best for the kid. You need to be a parent you need to be a therapist who understands the child. And because we have a program that is keeping them safe, you know that the safety net or the backstop is there. So you can do this project of understanding them without fixing them. And when you change the energy from fixing somebody or changing somebody or getting somebody where you think they need to go to understanding them, they heal themselves. And it takes a long time. I said this to the therapist yesterday, and I think this is true. Since we aren't going to fix your kid in 10 weeks, since we aren't going to fix you in a 5-day intensive, I really hope to accomplish 2 things as a treatment program. Number 1, give you some sense of your project that will be your theme or your lifelong project. Number 1. Number 2, give you a wonderful experience of feeling loved and seen and not judged or shamed. And so if down the line, 6 months later, a year later, 10 years later, you find yourself in crises again, you or your child, you'll say, I want to go back to therapy. I had a really good experience with Eleanor or with Matt or with Jamie or with Jay or with Trina or with Jordan or with Phil. I really had a good experience, and I want to go back to that. When people say that therapy is hard and uncomfortable, it is hard, but it's also healing and revitalizing. And when a therapist sees you, and that is his or her or their goal, it's pretty hard to find that unpleasant. It might be painful or uncomfortable because you're exploring painful and uncomfortable topics, but you're not alone in it. And that's really all we can ask for, because pain and grief is inevitable. But suffering, loneliness in our pain and grief is not inevitable. And that's why we have to find our people that believe what I am talking about tonight, that I was taught by somebody else. Somebody writes, my child excelled at evoke, reaching air phase, and has been in a therapeutic boarding school since January. We've noticed a great positive change with his social anxiety and defiance at home. He claims he is ready to come home and that the school is now boring with irritating kids and the cool kids have left, and we are wasting our money now. His therapist, who we love, recommends his staying till December. He is calling me now and being combative and demanding about leaving, which reminds me of his attitude before leaving for Evoke a year ago. When do we know when he's ready to leave? You know when he's ready to leave because you're ready to have him. Period. Full stop. When you're ready, he's ready. I really watch for, when I'm talking to parents, if they think in black and white, pass and fail ways. I don't think that that's a readiness. If you're ready to give it a try. But you said what you said, which is the only thing you need to know. He might feel very strongly about it. He might have shown very good, fantastic progress. But to regress to old, I'm going to tell all of you a story. I got permission from my wife to tell this. I told her I don't always like to tell stories where she stumbles. I'd rather tell stories where I stumble. But part of the story shows what I think is absolute strength and courage. I won't go into the weeds and all the details, but my wife had a situation with her stepmother. Her father's in hospital care, nursing care. We don't know how much longer, if he will recover, or how much longer he might live. And at one point, her stepmother said she's going to take a vacation. He's been sick on and off for a while now. So my wife's stepmother, is going to take a vacation. And my wife was very angry at that and felt very abandoned. And she proceeded to kind of shame and bully her stepmother, to tell her how crazy the idea was, how she can't just leave. Tried to instill the fear of God into her. Said, what if dad dies while you're gone? You know, where are you going? And the trip seems gratuitous. Right? Just bullied and shamed her. And my wife came home and shared that with me. She had talked to her best friend before talking to me, and I listened for a long time. I thought it was an interesting story. I listened for a long time. That's an important detail. I listened for about an hour. And then afterwards I said, do you want to hear some different thoughts? And my wife said, sure, which is amazing because she means it. And I said, it sounds like you really bullied her, when really what is required in this situation is for you to go to your father and your stepmother and say, here's my boundaries. I can't pick up all the slack if you go away for a month. And I said to my wife, I have no opinion about how much of the slack you pick up, or your brother. You can go over there 5 times a day. You can go over there once a week. You can go over there not at all. I have no opinion about that. But it is your responsibility to state your boundaries, and then to deal with the shame and the guilt that comes from being a bad daughter, if that's what comes up for you. And I said to my wife, you kind of did what most of us do, which is we try to control and manipulate others emotionally by using fear or shame or leverage or threats. We try to control them and their behavior so we don't have to do our work, which is our boundaries. We don't have to look into the face of the monster, the guilt monster, and sort it out. What's amazing about my wife is to hear your husband give you that kind of feedback or offer that kind of an idea. I don't think that's easy for very many people. My wife was amazing about it. And she said, you're 100% right. She ended up writing a text and then calling her stepmother and apologizing and owning this process. I bullied you and shamed you so that I didn't have to work on setting my boundaries. So I am sorry for doing that. And here is my boundary. Here's what I can do if you go away for a week, because it was going to be a month. Here's what I can do if you go away for a month, And oh, by the way, Brad and I are going to be gone traveling during one of the weeks. Do you see that the great strength in my wife and her ability to hear that difficult feedback, to look at herself, to see her part in it, to see how, yes, that might have been. She said to me at one point, she said, I'm not even sure my stepmother knows how bad the conversation was. I think she probably just thinks that's the way people talk to each other. And I said, I agree, absolutely. Most people think that's a normal way to treat each other because that's what most people do. They bully and shame and control and try to frighten out. Therapists do that to you. You get shamed and bullied and threatened and told the worst case scenario. So back to the question, work on your boundaries, work on your project. Set the clear boundaries, but trying to manipulate, even, this is important, even if you think it's for the greater good, you're still not in control, and it's not your purview to try to change what someone else feels, thinks, and does. If your child is under 18, yes, you have boundaries and limits and walls that you set up to manage and help you with your job in parenting. But ultimately, on a spiritual level, I say this to my children all the time, even though we have boundaries, I can't stop you. I know. I just want to get that out there at the outset. I can't stop or control your behavior. So back to the parent with the child at boarding school who's bullying them, I would address it. I would say, so what, because the question is, I said this to the students yesterday. So what happens when you come home and I have a boundary and you don't agree with that one? Is this what we're going to do again? Because we've already done this before and I'm not willing to go back there. So if you feel really strongly about something and I don't agree with you and I don't give you what you want, then I'm going to be shamed and bullied and threatened and nagged, because I won't do that. I won't. And what you're doing right now concerns me. And you feel justified. I get it. And you feel justified in what you're doing because you think you're right. And you that's what you were doing at home. You've learned a lot. You have some tools. Most of the time under moderate levels of stress, you can do it really well. But I'm not going to go back to this old dynamic. That's what I would say. Or that's the energy I would bring to the conversation. All right, folks. My books, The Audacity to Be You and The Journey of the Heroic Parent, are available on Amazon or Audible. We have support groups September 9th. That's tomorrow. Tomorrow for Wilderness, Current, and Alumni families. 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time, September 14th for intensives, alumni. And then alumni-only meetings we're doing once a week now, September 28th. Email malia@evoketherapy.com for more information. If you want to do your own work, if you want to be in a place to find your people, at least for 5 days, if not for a lifetime or for a season. Intensives are, to me, the best way that you can do this. The next one is October 20th. We also have online offerings, which are shorter, less time and less money, but can accomplish much of the same thing. I'm really impressed with them. We also have a Returning to You that is full in October. We'll be opening up another one. Email intensives@evoketherapy if you want to learn more or learn about an upcoming session. We have online coaches who do understand this process that I'm talking about, this attachment-based work. There are Evoke therapists and Evoke intensive therapists. So if you want a therapist or a virtual coach that can do the kind of work that I'm teaching, contact Travis@evoketherapy.com to find a coach. We have Pursuits Trips, which are 3 to 30-day programs for families or young adults. Think Therapy Light or Sober Fun or Reconnection. They're customized anywhere in the world. We ask all current parents to go to 6 12-step support groups. I mentioned these earlier in the broadcast. Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, or Adult Children. Also, refugerecovery.org and NAMI.org are great places to go to find classes, support groups in your local community free of charge. All of these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app. Just search Finding You an Evoke Therapy podcast on your favorite podcast platform, or you can just go to soundcloud.com on your computer and listen there. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram using the handles @EvokeTherapy or @Dr. Brad Reedy. You can also find us on Instagram using the handle @EvokeTherapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And then, of course, our blog. Our wonderful Malia just wrote a very heartfelt personal story about 9/11 and a loss that she experienced and working through the grief. So thank you, Malia, for sharing part of yourself. And if you want to see upcoming content, check in on our blog because Malia does a wonderful job curating. She's not always writing the blog, but she does a wonderful job curating the blog and adding new content every week. The next broadcast will be September 13th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. That's Monday, where I'll be talking about dealing with resistance. One of my very favorite topics as a therapist, parent, is talking about resistance and how to deal with resistance in a way that makes it not worse, that makes it lower, that makes it that helps it to go away instead of provoking it. So that's this Monday, the 13th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for on behalf of the people that you love, that you're willing to do your work and look at yourself. I hope you have a great week. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. Take care, and I'll talk to you Monday. Bye-bye.